There is a kind of silence that does not belong in a forest. Not the quiet of dawn or the pause before rain, but the silence of everything alive, deciding at the same time to stop making sound. In the summer of 1895, a timber cruiser named Amos Treadwell walked into a valley in the Appalachian Mountains and found that silence waiting for him. The journal he kept over the next 3 weeks records what happened when the silence came and what happened to the 31 people who were still there when it did not leave. What he wrote is one of the strangest documents I have ever come across in all my years of doing this. Before we go any further, I want you to do something for me. Look in the description of this video and in the pinned comment below. There is a link there to something called the Appalachian Dossier, a collection of records that were quietly erased from official American archives. Go check it now or come back to it after the story. It's waiting for you. Now, let me tell you about Amos Treadwell. He was 42 years old, in the summer of 1895, a timber cruiser from Knoxville, Tennessee. That's a man who walks ahead of logging crews to mark which trees are worth cutting and which should be left standing. He was tall for his time, narrow through the shoulders, with a long, sunburnt face and a beard. He kept short with a straight razor every Sunday, whether the camp had hot water or not. His hands were the hands of a man who had spent 15 years inside a forest, the kind of hands that didn't quite uncurl all the way when they rested on a table. He had a soft voice. He almost never raised it. The men who worked under him said you could tell Treadwell was angry only because he got quieter, never louder. He did not drink. He did not lie. The men who knew him said that if Treadwell told you the creek would freeze on Tuesday, you set your pack accordingly. He measured what was in front of him, and he wrote it down, and that was the whole of his method. He was hired that spring by the Gatlin Timber Company to survey a valley called Wren Hollow, high in the Appalachian Mountains, where the company wanted to mark stands of spruce and hemlock for the coming logging season. He entered the valley on foot with a pack mule, a theodolite, a compass, marking chalk, and an axe. The nearest logging camp was a half-day's walk south over the ridge. The nearest town was 3 days beyond that. Wren Hollow does not appear on any modern map, and it did not appear on any map in 1895 either. The people who lived there called it that because of the wrens that nested in the rock, faces along the eastern ridge, small brown birds that sang from first light until dark and filled the valley with a sound like water running over smooth stones. About 31 people lived in Wren Hollow, spread across 6 homesteads built along the valley floor between the ridges. They were Scots-Irish stock who had come through the Cumberland Gap 2 generations before and kept walking until the road ran out, and the only thing ahead was more mountain. Between the ridges, the ground was fertile enough for corn and sorghum, and the families grew what they could in the narrow strips of flat ground along the creek. They kept hogs and chickens and a few head of cattle. They gathered wild plants from the hillsides for medicine, the way their mothers had taught them. Everything they did was geared toward survival, and they had been surviving long enough that the doing of it had become quiet and automatic. A circuit preacher came through twice a year, a man who rode horseback between the scattered settlements and carried in his saddlebags the only connection these families had to the world beyond the ridges. The rest of the time, the people of Wren Hollow were alone. They traded among themselves, married among themselves, and buried their dead in a small clearing on the north slope where the morning sun hit first. Treadwell arrived at the Tackett homestead on the evening of the 14th of June, 1895. Wade Tackett was 58, the patriarch of the largest family in the valley. A thick-handed man who moved slowly and spoke the same way, as if each word had to be weighed before it was set down. He offered Treadwell the porch for the night without being asked. His wife, Martha, gray-haired and flour-dusted, brought out cornbread and a jug of sorghum and set them on the porch rail without a word, and went back inside. Their sons, Emmett, 24, and Curtis, 21, sat on the steps and watched Treadwell the way men watch a stranger in a place where strangers do not come, with a caution that was not hostility, but something older. Treadwell noted in his journal that the family was courteous, but tense, the way people get when something is wrong that they haven't found words for yet. He wrote that Wade rolled a cigarette and offered him one, and sat in the chair across from him, and did not speak for a long time, and that the silence between them was comfortable in the way that silence between mountain men can be, but that it was not the only silence in the valley that evening. The cornbread was good. The sorghum was dark and thick. The evening was warm. He also noted in a single line at the bottom of the page that he had not heard a single bird since entering the valley. Treadwell woke before dawn on his first morning in Wren Hollow. He stepped off the porch into the gray half-light and stood still and listened. There was nothing to hear. He had been in dozens of Appalachian hollows by that point in his career, and there's always sound at dawn in a forest. Wrens and thrushes calling across the ridges, crows working the tree lines, the chatter of squirrels in the canopy, tree frogs winding down from the night, the creek moving over its stones. He stood on the pack dirt in front of the Tackett cabin and heard none of it. The creek ran clear and quiet. The trees stood without movement. The air was warm and still and empty of every sound a forest makes when it is alive. He walked to his mule. The animal was agitated, pulling at its tether with a steadiness that was worse than panic, ears pinned flat against its skull, eyes rolling to show the white. Treadwell had worked with mules for years, and he knew the difference between an animal having a bad morning and an animal that wanted to be somewhere else so badly it would pull its own halter apart to get there. This mule wanted to be somewhere else. He calmed it with a hand on its neck and a few quiet words, and he noted the behavior in his journal with the same precision he gave to timber measurements. He walked the valley floor for an hour listening. No insects in the grass. No frogs at the creek. The creek itself ran clean over smooth stones, but quietly, as if it too had decided to make less noise than it should. He stopped at the edge of the cornfield and stood among the stalks, and heard nothing but his own breathing and the faint creak of his boots on the dry ground. He walked to the eastern ridge where the wrens had nested, and stood at the base of the rock faces, and looked up at the empty crevices, and listened. And the silence that came back at him was not the silence of a place where nothing is. It was the silence of a place where everything has left, he wrote in his journal. The silence here is not natural. I have no other word for it yet. He found Wade on the porch, rolling a cigarette in the early light, the paper and the tobacco, and the motion of his thick fingers, so practiced they could have been doing it in the dark. Treadwell asked him about the silence. Wade was slow to answer. He lit the cigarette and sat with it between his fingers and looked out across the valley toward the eastern ridge, where the wrens had always nested. He told Treadwell that the birds had left about 2 weeks before. The wrens first, then the thrushes, then the crows. After the birds, the insects went quiet. Then the frogs at the creek stopped calling. One night, all at once, the way a conversation stops when someone walks into a room. The dogs would not leave the porches. The horses would not go past the tree line. Wade stated this the way a man states a fact he has been sitting with for 2 weeks, without speculation, without theory, without the kind of explanation that a man reaches for when he does not want to sit with the thing any longer. He did not say why. He said what he had observed, and he let it sit between them like a stone on a table. Treadwell, a rational man who trusted his instruments and his experience, considered what he knew. Drought could drive birds from a valley, but the creek was full and the corn was green. Disease could thin a population, but not every species at once, and not the insects and the frogs and the dogs and the horses too. A predator could quiet a stretch of woods, for a day, maybe 2, but not 2 weeks, and not an entire valley 4 miles long. He checked the soil, the trees, the water. Everything was healthy. There was no visible reason for the wildlife to have left. He wrote, I told myself it was a migration pattern I had not seen before. I was lying to myself, and I knew it. But the lie got me through the morning. What he could not know, what no one in that valley could know yet, was that the silence was not the worst of it. The silence was only the first thing. The worst was what came after, when the silence had been there long enough to make the people who heard it start to disappear. Wade told him about the disappearances that evening. After Martha had cleared the plates, and the boys had gone to do the chores, and the dark had settled into the valley like something poured. He sat in the chair on the porch with his cigarette and told Treadwell about Jonah Pollard, the way a man tells a story he has told himself too many times already, flat and careful and without emotion. Old Jonah Pollard was 63, a trapper who had worked a trapline on the north ridge of Wren Hollow for 40 years. He was lean and weathered, with a face like leather left in the sun, and he knew those woods the way other men know the rooms of their own house, every tree and every rock and every drainage, and he walked that trapline every week with the certainty of a man following a hallway in the dark. He went out on a Tuesday morning, 3 days before Treadwell arrived, and he did not come back. His son, Amos Pollard, 30, went looking the next morning. He was a quieter man than his father, broader in the chest, with the careful hands of someone who had grown up watching a trapper work and had learned that patience was the first tool. He followed the trail up the north ridge to the first set of traps, and found them still set, undisturbed, the bait untouched. He followed the trail to the second set and the third. All the same. Traps set, bait fresh, no sign that Jonah had reached any of them. Amos tracked his father's boot prints up the ridge, and the prints were clear in the soft ground, steady and even, the walking of a man who knew where he was going and was not hurrying. The trail led up through the hemlock and out onto open ground near the ridgeline, and there the prints stopped. Amos told Wade this, and Wade told Treadwell. The boot prints stopped on flat, open ground. No cliff edge, no loose soil, no sinkhole, no sign of a fall, no sign of a struggle, no blood, no drag marks, no broken branches, no disturbance of any kind. The man walked up the ridge and stopped walking, and there was no evidence of where he went after that. Amos searched the area for 2 hours, walking in widening circles from the last print, checking every rock and every stand of trees. He found nothing. He came home and told his family, and the family did not say much, because there was not much to say. Treadwell visited the Pollard homestead the next morning. Jonah's daughter-in-law, Ruth, was 34, a thin woman with dark hair pulled back and hands that moved carefully, as if she was afraid of breaking something she was holding. She sat on the porch with her son Augustus, who was 18, tall for his age and still growing into his frame, with the long limbs of a boy who had not yet finished becoming what he would be. Ruth was calm in the way people are calm when they have passed through fear into something flatter and quieter on the other side. A calm that is not peace, but the absence of the energy required to be afraid. She did not cry. She did not plead. She told Treadwell that Jonah knew those woods the way other men know the rooms of their own house, that he walked that trap line every week for 40 years, that he did not get lost, and he did not fall. She said it the way someone reads a sentence they have already memorized, each word in its place, no emphasis anywhere, the meaning worn down to a nub. Treadwell climbed the north ridge that afternoon, alone, against Wade's advice. He found the spot where the boot prints ended. He confirmed what Amos Pollard had described. Every detail. The tracks were clear in the ground, steady and even, and they stopped on flat, open ground. No cliff, no hole, no disturbance of any kind. He knelt and examined the last print and the earth around it, pressing his fingers into the soil to test its firmness. The ground was solid, packed hard, the kind of ground that takes a print and holds it. A man had walked to this spot and ceased to be here, and there was no physical explanation for it that Treadwell's 5 years in the woods could provide. He recorded it in his journal with the care of a surveyor documenting a measurement. He did not speculate. He wrote what he saw. The tracks, the condition of the traps, the flat ground, the absence of any explanation. He noted the date, the 15th of June, 1895. He asked Wade that evening if anyone else had gone missing. Wade paused with the cigarette halfway to his mouth, a pause that lasted longer than it should have, like the man was deciding whether to say the next thing or let it go. He said a young woman named Callie Meeks, 19 years old, had gone to the spring for water 4 days before. Her family found the bucket at the spring full. The water was still. No tracks leaving the spring except the ones going in. She had walked to the spring and filled the bucket, and the bucket was there, and she was not, and that was all anyone could say about it. The valley had 31 people in it when Treadwell arrived. 2 were already gone. The silence continued, and Treadwell did not yet know that the worst of the counting was still ahead. Treadwell spent the next several days surveying the valley's timber, working the eastern ridge where the spruce grew thick and straight, the kind of trees the Gatlin Company wanted most. He marked trees with his chalk and recorded measurements in his ledger. Diameter, height, estimated board feet, location relative to the creek and the ridge line. The work was ordinary, and he did it the way he always did it, with the steady patience of a man who understood that a job done correctly is its own form of sanity. The valley was not ordinary. He noted the silence in his journal each morning, the way a farmer notes the weather. Still no birds, still no insects. The creek runs quiet. The dogs remain on the porch. The entries are brief and factual. He was a man who wrote what he observed, and what he observed was the absence of everything that should have been there. He began to notice the pattern in the disappearances. They happened at night, or in the early hours before dawn, in the dark stretch between midnight and first light. They happened to people who were alone. Nobody had vanished from a group. Nobody had been taken from inside a cabin with other people in it. The taking, if that was the word for it, happened in the open, in the silent spaces between the homesteads, in the hours when the valley was at its quietest and a person could walk 100 yards without seeing another soul. There was something about being alone in that silence that mattered, something about the separation from others that seemed to be the condition. And Treadwell noted this in his journal, without trying to explain it, because the pattern was clear even if the cause was not. He walked Jonah Pollard's trap line himself on the 3rd day alone, against Wade's advice for the 2nd time. He told Wade he wanted to see the full line, end to end, to understand where Jonah had been and what he might have encountered. Wade told him not to go, told him in the slow, flat way he said everything, that a man alone on that ridge was a man who might not come back. Treadwell went anyway, because he was a man who trusted his own judgment. The trap line ran 3 miles along the north ridge, through hemlock and spruce and dense laurel thicket that grabbed at his clothes and slowed his progress. He found every trap still set, every bait untouched. The woods were silent. He walked for 2 hours, and heard nothing but his own footsteps, and the creak of his pack straps, and the sound of his own breathing, which was louder than it should have been, because everything else was so quiet. He stopped at the point where Jonah's tracks had ended and stood on the flat ground and looked around at the trees and the sky and the ridge continuing upward, and he felt something he could only describe later as a pressure, not a sound, not a wind, not a visible thing of any kind. A pressure in the air, like the feeling before a storm that does not break, the kind of weight that makes a man aware of the back of his own neck and the space behind him that he cannot see without turning. He stood there for a full minute, and the feeling did not change, and it did not leave, and it did not grow or shrink. It was simply there, the way the silence was there, as if the air itself had become a thing that was aware of him. He wrote, "The woods here feel occupied. I cannot say by what. I can say that the feeling did not leave when I did." On the 5th day of Treadwell's stay in Wren Hollow, the 18th of June, Ruth's son Augustus went to the spring before dawn to fill the water buckets. He was 18, and he wanted to help, and the spring was 100 yards from the cabin. A walk he had made every morning since he was old enough to carry a bucket without spilling. His mother told him to wait until there was light, told him in the careful voice she used for things that mattered. He went anyway, because he was 18, and he did not believe that a walk he had made 1,000 times could become a walk he would not come back from. He did not come back. Ruth found his bucket at the spring, full, the water still. The same as Callie Meeks. She carried the bucket back to the cabin, and set it on the table and sat in the chair, and folded her hands in her lap. She did not say anything for a long time. The water in the bucket was clean and clear, and it caught the lamplight and held it, and Ruth sat beside it with her hands folded and her face doing nothing, and the quiet in that cabin was a quiet that Treadwell did not enter, and did not try to enter. He wrote about it with the restraint of a man who had learned that the words he had were not the right ones and might never be. He did not describe Ruth's grief in emotional terms. He described what she did, the actions and the objects, the bucket and the table and the chair and the hands. She carried the bucket. She set it down. She sat in the chair and folded her hands in her lap. He wrote, "I have no words for what that looked like. I will not try." The valley was down to 28 people. 3 were gone. The silence was total now, so complete that it had its own weight, its own presence, the way a deep snow has presence, even when there is no wind to move it. Wade sent Curtis down the trail that day to meet the circuit preacher on the main path and bring him in early, because the families had decided they needed someone who knew the old accounts, someone who might have words for what was happening when their own words had run out. Before we go any further, I want to say something. This story is being told to you by the fear behind you. If you've made it this far without subscribing, tap that button now. And if you're hearing this on a channel that isn't ours, someone has taken our work without permission, report it for us. Now let me get back to the valley. Reverend Josiah Marsh arrived in Wren Hollow on the 20th of June, 1895. Wade had sent Curtis down the trail 2 days before to meet the preacher on the main path and bring him in early, but the boy had come back empty-handed, because the trail had led him home again the way it led everyone home now. Marsh came anyway over the western ridge, a path he had ridden once before and remembered by the shape of the terrain. He came into the valley on a tired horse, with his saddlebags over his shoulder and his Bible in his hand, and the first thing he did when he dismounted at the Tackett cabin was stop and stand in the yard and listen. He was 47 gaunt, with a long face and wire-rimmed spectacles that he cleaned with a handkerchief from his breast pocket. He had ridden this circuit for 8 years, visiting Wren Hollow twice a year, and he knew the valley the way a man knows a room he has slept in many times. He stood in the yard and he listened to the silence the way a doctor listens to a chest that should be breathing and is not, and his face did something that Treadwell recognized because Treadwell had seen it on his own face in the creek that morning of his first day. It was the face of a man hearing something he was not supposed to hear. He asked Wade how long it had been this quiet. Wade told him. Marsh did not respond right away. He went inside the cabin, set his saddlebags on the table, and opened the leather journal he carried to record the conditions of each settlement on his circuit, the number of families, the number of souls, the state of the buildings, the health of the people. He opened it, and he turned the pages, and he found what he was looking for, and then he sat down. What Marsh told the gathered families that evening was not a sermon. He did not stand at the front of the room. He did not raise his voice, or quote scripture, or call for prayer. He sat at the Tackett table with the journal open in front of him, and he read from it with the flat precision of someone reading a deed or a will, documenting what was recorded by a hand other than his own. Before Marsh, an older preacher had served this same circuit for 22 years. His name was Thaddeus Pike, and when he retired, he passed his journals to Marsh with the relief of someone setting down a load he could no longer carry, and the quiet instruction to read them when the time came. In those journals, Marsh had found an account from 1843, a valley in what is now western Virginia, where the same thing had happened. The birds left first, then the insects, then the frogs. Then the people began to disappear, one by one, in the dark hours, the ones who were alone. Marsh read from Pike's notes. He did not dramatize. He read the words as they were written, in the careful hand of a man who had been there and had recorded what he saw. The 1843 account described a valley called Wren Hollow, where 19 people vanished over 6 weeks. The silence came first, and then the taking, and then nothing. The county sent men to investigate, and they found cabins with food on the tables, and cold stoves, and no people, no bodies, no graves, no sign of violence or departure. Records were filed with the county clerk, and then forgotten. The way things are forgotten, the people do not want to remember. This is what Marsh read. Treadwell listened from the corner of the room, leaning against the wall with his arms folded, and he wrote in his journal afterward. The preacher's account matches what I have seen here in every particular. The silence, the sequence, the disappearances of those who are alone, the absence of bodies or explanation. I do not know what that means. I know that a man writing the same thing 52 years ago in a different valley does not make it less real. It makes it less likely to be a thing that happens once. The families did not react the way Treadwell expected. They were not panicked. They were not crying out or pleading with the preacher to tell them what to do, or asking God for deliverance in the way that people in houses of worship ask for deliverance. They sat and they listened, and their faces did something that Treadwell could only describe as recognition, not surprise, but recognition. As if they already knew this was not the first time, even without the preacher's records, even without the journal from 1843. As if the valley had told them itself, in the way it had gone quiet, in the way the trails led back, in the way the people they loved had walked out the door and not come back. As if the silence was a language they had been hearing for 2 weeks and were only now beginning to understand. Treadwell decided to leave the valley on the morning of the 20th of June, the same day the preacher arrived. He told Wade he would go for help, that he would reach the logging camp by noon, and send men back with supplies and weapons and whatever else was needed. He packed his mule with his instruments and his journal, and 3 days' worth of cornbread and dried meat, and he followed the trail he had come in on, the path that ran along the creek and over the southern ridge. He knew the route. He had walked it 6 days before, and he had noted its features in his journal with the care of a man who marks a trail so that others can follow it. It was a half-day's walk to the logging camp, and he expected to be there by noon. He walked for 4 hours. The trail was familiar, the creek on his left, the ridge climbing above him through hemlock and laurel. He crested the southern ridge and began the descent on the other side. The trees thinned as the elevation dropped, and after another hour of walking he saw a clearing ahead through the trees. He saw a cabin. He saw a porch. He saw Wade Tackett's chair and the smoke from Martha's stove. He was back where he started. He stopped on the trail and stood there and looked at the Tackett cabin and did not move for a long time. Then he checked his compass. The needle spun in a slow, patient circle, turning like a man looking for something he could not find. He tapped the glass. The needle did not respond. He took the backup compass from his pack, a second instrument he carried, because he did not trust a single tool for a job that mattered, and the second compass did the same thing. He sat on the ridge and wrote in his journal. His handwriting at this point was still steady. He recorded what happened with the same precision he gave to timber measurements, the same flat care, because the recording was the only thing he could control, and he intended to control it. He did not use the word trapped. He did not use the word hopeless. He wrote, "I have attempted to leave the valley by the southern trail. After 5 hours of walking, I return to my starting point. The trail appears to function normally during transit, but returns the traveler to the point of origin. My compasses are not functioning. The needles rotate continuously without settling. I am unable to determine the cause. He tried a second time that afternoon, leaving by a different route. He went up the eastern ridge, bushwhacking cross-country through dense hemlock, pushing through laurel thicket that grabbed at his legs and his pack, climbing steep ground with no trail at all, navigating by the shape of the terrain and the position of the sun, which was visible through the canopy in patches. He walked for 3 hours, climbing hard, and he reached the ridgeline and looked down the other side. He saw the valley. He saw the creek. He saw the Tackett cabin, small and still in the distance, with its smoke rising straight up into the still air. He sat on the ridge, and he did not write anything for a long time. The valley below him was quiet and green and whole, and it looked the way a valley is supposed to look from above, peaceful and contained. And he understood now that the peace was the containment, that the valley held the people in it the way a hand holds water, not by force but by the simple fact of being closed. Then he opened the journal and wrote, "Second attempt, Eastern Ridge, no trail, 3 hours. Return to valley. The valley does not appear to permit departure." He went back down to the cabins and told Wade and the preacher what had happened. Wade only nodded. He was not surprised, and the not surprised was worse than surprise would have been, because it meant Wade had already learned this fact on his own, and had been sitting with it. He told Treadwell that Curtis had tried to leave 2 days before, to go meet the preacher on the main trail, and the boy had walked for 5 hours and ended up at his own front door. Curtis had not said much about it. He sat on the porch steps and looked at the ground and did not offer an explanation. The valley would not let them leave. Nobody said this out loud. Nobody needed to. It was understood the way the silence was understood, the way the disappearances were understood, as a fact that had been tested and confirmed and that no longer required discussion or debate. The valley was a closed thing, and they were inside it, and the silence was not going to end, and the people who were alone in the dark were not going to stop disappearing. That evening Treadwell wrote a single line in his journal, the handwriting still steady, the words still chosen with care. "I am a man who has always trusted his instruments. My instruments are telling me nothing. The valley is telling me something I do not want to hear." The remaining people gathered in the Tackett cabin and the 2 adjacent homesteads over the next 2 days, moving in groups of 3 and 4. Never alone, never out of sight of each other. They boarded the windows with planks from the barn. They kept fires burning in the hearths day and night, and they kept the lamps lit, and they did not go outside after dark for any reason, not for water, not for wood, not for anything. The preacher read scripture each evening, the same passages he always read, the 23rd Psalm, and the passage from Job, about the things that walk in darkness, and the places where the light does not reach. Treadwell continued his journal. The entries were shorter now, the paragraphs compressed to lines, the lines compressed to notations, but the hand was still steady, and the facts were still facts, and he wrote them down because writing them down was the last thing he could do that still made sense. The disappearances did not stop. They slowed, but they did not stop. On the 3rd night, the Meeks family, 4 people, were gone. Their cabin was 50 yards from the Tackett cabin, close enough to hear a cough through the walls. Nobody heard anything. In the morning, Emmett went to check on them and found the cabin empty. The door was still barred from the inside, the heavy oak bar seated in its iron brackets, the way it had been set the night before. Treadwell wrote, "The door was barred from the inside. I checked it myself. The bar was in its brackets, seated firm, undisturbed. The family was not inside. I do not have an explanation. I am recording what I found." He did not try to explain it, he recorded it, and moved on, the way a man records a measurement that does not fit and keeps working. The dogs disappeared next. Wade's two hounds, old animals that had been with the family for years and had not left the porch since the silence began, were there at dusk, lying against the wall, with their heads on their paws and their eyes open. They did not bark. They did not whine in the morning. They were not on the porch. The chain that had tethered the older dog to the rail was still clipped to its ring, the clip closed, the chain lying on the boards in a loose coil. The dog was not attached to it. Treadwell did not hear them leave. He wrote, "I did not hear them leave. I did not hear anything. I was awake. I was sitting by the fire, with the journal in my lap. The dogs were on the porch when I closed my eyes, and they were not on the porch when I opened them. There was no sound between those two moments. The journal entries got shorter after that. They went from full lines to fragments of lines, and the fragments got shorter, and the spaces between them got longer. This is the part of the manuscript where Treadwell's handwriting changes, and the change is visible on the page. The way a change in weather is visible on a horizon. Up until the night the dogs vanished, the writing had been steady and even. The writing of a careful man, recording careful facts, each letter formed with the same pressure, each line running straight across the page. After that night, the letters leaned forward as if the pen were being pushed by a hand that had begun to hurry, and the lines ran a little crooked, as if the writer could not quite hold himself still in his chair. The last entry is dated the 3rd of July, 1895. It's 3 lines, written in the hurried, leaning hand that had replaced his steady one. And the words are simple, and they're the last words he wrote. 20 remaining. The fire is still burning. I do not think it matters. In October 1895, a 3-man survey party from the Gatlin Timber Company entered Wren Hollow looking for Treadwell, who had not returned from his survey and had not sent word. They came over the southern ridge on the trail that Treadwell had described in his journal, the same trail that had led him back to the valley twice, and they found that it led them in without trouble, because the valley let things in the way it did not let things out. They found the cabins intact. 6 homesteads, all standing, all whole, nothing damaged or disturbed, food on the tables, dried beans and cornbread, and a jar of sorghum with the lid off. A kettle on a cold stove, the water inside it long evaporated. Treadwell's journal on the table in the Tackett cabin, open to the last page, the 3 lines visible in the lamplight. The preacher's saddlebags by the door, his Bible inside, his spectacles folded on top. The mules in a pen behind the cabin, alive, thin but alive, eating the grass that had grown up through the fence rails. No people, no bones, no graves. Nothing broken, nothing overturned, nothing that suggested violence or struggle or flight. The 31 people who had lived in Wren Hollow, plus the timber cruiser and the circuit preacher, 33 in all, were gone. The company men left and reported what they found. The county sheriff was notified, and a search party of 9 men spent 2 weeks in the valley and the surrounding ridges. They found nothing. No bodies, no clothing, no signs of a mass grave. The records were filed with the county clerk, noting the disappearance of 33 persons from Wren Hollow, cause unknown. Those records were later removed from the county files. Not lost, not misfiled. Removed. They are among the accounts gathered in the Appalachian dossier. The link in the description and the pinned comment below. The valley is still there. The birds came back the following spring. The cabins are gone now, rotted back into the ground. But the silence has been reported in other valleys since, in other years, in places where the birds go quiet and the people go still. If you're still with me, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. The town, the country, the road, if there's no town, I read every one of them.